Okay, Rick, it is okay if we record this, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. It is a true pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Richard Kammen is a name. I did not practice criminal law, but for 40 years I did practice civil law, and the name I kept hearing with regard to criminal practice was always Rick Kammen. And he has defended everything from DUIs to capital murder cases. And one of his latest, which I noted in his bio, and I think you're justifiably proud of this, that in all the criminal or the capital murder cases that Rick was counsel on, he never had a client who was sentenced to the death penalty. And that matches Clarence Darrow, who always prided himself on the fact that all of the death penalty cases he handled, he never had a client sentenced to the death penalty. In recent years, Rick was appointed, volunteered, I think is the correct term, as a defense lawyer for the folks in those imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay. And that experience led him to write his recent book. Do you have a copy there, Rick, you can hold up?
I do.
There we go. Tortured Justice, Guantanamo. It is a novel, not a nonfiction book. And we hope Rick will talk about in his discussion the reason he chose to go that way as opposed to writing nonfiction. But anyway, it's a true pleasure to introduce to you, and I use this term rarely, if ever, a true giant in the legal profession in Indiana, Richard Kammen.
Thank you very much. I have to say that first, I'm honored, really honored to be here as a new writer. You know, the opportunity to speak with other writers is really rewarding. And I think Clarence Darrow is probably turning over in his grave the fact that I would be mentioned in the same sentence as him. Appreciate kind of praise, but I think it's I don't even know what to say to it. A little bit of background, as Steve said, I practiced criminal law for really close to 50 years, and a large portion of my practice in the last 20 years became defending federal death penalty cases around the country. There were a group of lawyers who essentially made themselves available to be appointed as public defenders in death penalty cases. And over the years, I was lead counsel on about 35 or 40 state and federal death penalty cases, a few in Indiana. Most were federal cases throughout the United States in such diverse locations as Las Vegas, Nashville, Detroit, Des Moines, Iowa, Vermont, really all over. And as a result of that, in 2007, I was one of the group of lawyers that was recruited by the American Civil Liberties Union to represent or to assist military lawyers who were assigned to represent people who were charged with death penalty offenses in Guantanamo Bay. And at that time, the two cases that were in that wheelhouse were the 5 people charged, excuse me, with the 9/11 attack, and our client, who I ended up representing, Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri, who was alleged to be the mastermind of the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000. Now, all of those people and I'll focus on Nashiri for just briefly, were for 4 years subjected to various degrees of torture by the Central Intelligence Agency at what are called black sites, which were really torture centers throughout the world. And I represented and was lead counsel for Nashiri for really close to 10 years. I left the case and well, just to anticipate a question, I was hired, if you will, by the ACLU, and then in 2010, my employment morphed and I became a contractor for the Department of Defense. And I worked on the case till 2017 when we discovered that there were microphones in the room where we were meeting with our client, and the military judge refused to give a hearing on that, refused to force the government to really tell us anything about it, and put us in the impossible position of not being able to knowingly meet with our client in secure situation. And so myself and two other civilian lawyers under our rules of professional responsibility were obligated to withdraw from the case. This created kind of a huge storm. Not kind of, it was, because for a time the judge was threatening to issue arrest warrants for me and the other two lawyers because we were ordered to come to Guantanamo, and refused to do that, and taking advantage of a law that says a U.S. citizen can't be required to appear in Guantanamo. And so, there was all this backstory. Ultimately, the courts sided with us and concluded that the judge was wrong, and so really by 2019, my direct involvement with the case was over. Over the course of this time, I became interested in writing. And I spend part of my time in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. It's where I am now. And here in San Miguel, there are a number of writing groups, and I became involved with one or two of them, and began experimenting with writing in general, writing memoir, writing personal essays, that sort of thing. And ultimately began experimenting with writing a book about my involvement with Nashiri. And I originally envisioned it as a nonfiction book, and did a book proposal and talked to some agents, and actually had an agent who really concluded that there didn't seem to be much market for that. But I think the reality, when I took a step back and looked at it a little more objectively, was it really wasn't that interesting a story. From the legal point of view, it was, gosh, I was involved in this big case. The government was mean to me and I quit. And, they threatened to arrest me, but they didn't. And, and so when I took a step back, it was sort of, so what? But the other piece of it was between classification issues, because I still do hold what's called a TSSCI security clearance, which is about the highest level of security clearance, because I was obligated to submit anything I wrote to various governmental agencies as a result of that. But also there are issues of attorney-client privilege. The case is still ongoing. And so really sitting down to write that story became very difficult. And the more I wrote bits and pieces of it, the more I realized that both the obligation to be accurate and then the problems with privilege, if nothing else, made it really difficult to tell what I thought was one of the most important pieces of the story, which was how my relationship with Nashiri went from who the hell are you? Why are you here? I have no reason to talk to you. I have no reason to trust you. To over the course of time, please don't leave. And so that story became difficult to tell in anything other than the most general sense. Sometime before COVID, I began experimenting with nonfiction. And it really started as a lark. I invented a protagonist who's a lawyer, who's obviously younger, thinner, had hair. I just began writing scenes, and it was really just for fun, for me. And over the course of a few months, two things happened. First, I would, several times when I was asleep, think of scenes, and they would become so clear to me that it was easy to write. I could get up the next morning and really felt like I had seen it, felt like I could write the dialogue. And it just became easy to write 1,000, 1,500 words, relatively quickly, an hour or two. And the other thing I realized was that it was easier to tell the story in a fictional sense for two reasons. Number one, of course, I didn't have to deal with privilege issues and attorney-client issues. And secondly, I didn't have to be as wedded to accuracy, the actual details of events. And over the course of time, then I created a story that in some respects mimics Nashiri's case, but is completely fictional. The story involves a lawyer who is asked by the ACLU to represent the mastermind of an attack in Kuwait. Of course, there was no such attack in Kuwait. The defendant in that case is Yemeni and Saudi, and was in CIA torture centers, but this person doesn't exist. And really creating a team of lawyers, which was similar in the sense I had a team of lawyers I worked with in Guantanamo. But the lawyers could become an amalgam of, the fictional lawyers could become an amalgam of lawyers I dealt with in Guantanamo and over the years, and also lawyers who I dealt with who were prosecutors and stuff. So I could take the best and worst of people I dealt with in the course of my career and lump them into this situation. It really became a lot more fun for me as the writer, and I think became a lot easier to tell something approaching the realities of working in the Guantanamo environment. Now, there's two pieces to the book there's several pieces. A lot of it's entirely fictional, but the book I've written dramatizes a trial that I think is what a trial that if it were held in Guantanamo would look like. But there haven't been any trials of any death penalty trials in Guantanamo. And quite honestly, I'd be surprised if there are any, just because of the nature of the case and the litigation and the problems that with the military commission system that have just proved to be intractable. Now, one of the other interests is I did have to submit this to some various governmental agencies for a classification review. And that was a process partially due to COVID and partially due to the bureaucracy that took approximately 18 months. And there were probably half a dozen conversations in which I would have to tell the point of contact I was dealing with, look, this is fiction. These people don't exist. This attack didn't happen. This lawyer doesn't exist. There have been no trials. There's not likely to be any trials. So it's hard for you to say that things that don't exist didn't happen, where sort of the details are public knowledge, are classified. And in the end, they insisted on some redactions, which were really quite minimal, that really involved security issues that exist in Guantanamo Bay. And it was kind of funny because these are things that anyone who would be there, any member of the public who would happen to be there and be allowed to be there for any of the legal proceedings, could see, could talk about, they've been written about. But it frankly wasn't worth fighting over because it didn't advance, didn't impact the story, and the deletions, the reactions didn't change anything in any significant way. And so that became the sort of arc of what it was like to write this. And of course, as you all know, being writers, I mean, the editing process and going through and reading aloud, does this sound right? Is this sound true? Is it true as I know the world? Became actually, for me, a very, very fulfilling part of the process. I don't know that I had a goal when I started other than just to write for the sake of writing. But in the end, I think my goal was to tell 2 or 3 different stories. The first, of course, and to me, the most important arc of this particular book is the relationship between the lawyer and the client, which does, over the course of the book, start from, I have no reason to trust you, I don't like you, I don't want you to be my lawyer, to please don't leave, I love you. Also, I tried to capture some of the realities of torture. And the realities of torture really permeate Guantanamo litigation, but in 2 different ways. The first is they permeate the case, the evidence of the case. Everything about it is marred by torture. And the second, though, is it seeps into the participants. And I think virtually everyone who is involved, who's been involved in Guantanamo litigation, of people who've been tortured, has been personally affected by that. And I tried to describe, to the extent I could, in a fictional sense, from the way the characters respond to things, how that impacts the people who are involved. The third story is sort of building in to it a little bit of the culture in the military dealing with sexual assault of women in the military. And so there's a thread in the story of that. And then the fourth is an attempt, as I said, to describe what a trial, if there were to be a trial in Guantanamo, would look like. And then finally, and this is essentially, I suppose, there's a certain amount of maybe commercial piece to this. Essentially what the CIA, how they deal with things, and some of that is perhaps, it's certainly completely fictional, and while not far-fetched, certainly again is fictional. So that's been the arc of both my practice and I apologize for the background noise. Here in Mexico, the gas trucks come by and advert and with a loudspeaker. And so that's been the arc of both my career and my my involvement in Guantanamo and how this book came to be. Now, what I'd like to do is open this up to questions, because your questions will probably be a lot more interesting than what I might come up with. So anyone who has any questions, either about the writing, about Guantanamo, about the book, please ask.
Okay, Rick, I'm going to start off, if I may. Rick, I'm going to start off, if I may. We're getting some feedback here, which is a little annoying, but let me go ahead. We're getting some feedback here, which is a little annoying, but let me go. Have you received any reaction from any of the lawyers or the other people involved in the prosecutions down in Guantanamo? How they react to this? Guantanamo? How they react to this?
Well, the lawyers who were familiar with the writing process. I mean, the book's just come out, and so I don't know if any of the lawyers. I think some of them are reading it. They were all really, really supportive. There have been the books that have been written about Guantanamo have all been largely from the perspective of prisoners who were incarcerated there. The movie, some of you may have seen, The Mauritanian, is based on a book by a fellow who was there by the name of Mohamedou Salahi. And his book is, like most books, is probably better than the movie. But there have been no books from a lawyer's perspective about Guantanamo litigation. And so I think the lawyers who were there or presently are still there were quite supportive. And I mean, the dedication, and I meant this very seriously, the dedication in the book is, I'll read it. This book is dedicated to the men and women of the Military Commission's Defense Organization and the men and women who selflessly defended those who have been and are confined at Guantanamo. They, more than most, have done what lawyers should do: stand up and speak out for those who cannot stand or cannot be heard. And in many cases, these men and women sacrificed their careers and endured great personal and financial hardship. It is tragic that their achievements have gone largely unrecognized. But those who know, know. They did not let the bastards grind them down. And I sent that dedication out to the lawyers I know who were working on the case or who have worked on it when when the book was going to be published. And they were all really, I think, touched. I think they were really touched by that. And it's a dedication that really, I think, like most dedications, but certainly this came from my heart. I think they're very supportive.
Just so the folks in the group know, you're not the only one from Indiana who has done this. We had a recently retired Supreme Court Justice, Stephen David, who also was assigned as a judge advocate general to defend clients that were being held prisoner in Guantanamo.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. Justice David and I talked when I first got involved. He was at the tail end of his time as being the chief defense counsel, and we talked a lot at that time about sort of the weirdness that one guy from Indianapolis, another guy from Boone County could be in the middle of this. And one of the things I say in a disclaimer at the end of the book, and I won't read all of it, is I talk about the defense counsels, and the chief defense counsel in the book is kind of a jerk. And I say the real defense counsels were always completely supportive of the mission. 3, Dwight Sullivan, Stephen David, and John Baker are, in my view, undiscovered American heroes. And I've told Justice David that's my view of him, because when he was there, was in the end of the Bush, or during the Bush administration. And they conceived of Guantanamo as being a place where there would be very quick trials, really show trials. And then, of course, now we have dogs barking. And there would be show trials and then speedy executions. And Justice David and the group of lawyers who were there then basically said, no, we are not going to do that. And a lot of those lawyers really did sacrifice their military careers because they did the right thing. And so I really do feel that, as I said, Dwight Sullivan and Steve David and John Baker was the last defense counsel who stood up to the judge over the issue of the microphones. They really are undiscovered American heroes. I think that's very, very true.
That actually brings up a question that's posted, and I don't know if you can see the chat page on this, but Bridget asked if you were able to weave any portion of the eavesdropping into the book.
Yes. In fact, one of the threads, and this is, I mean, we discovered it really through sort of happenstance. And that's to some extent still classified, so I can't really talk about the details of how we discovered it. But in the book, one of the things that happens is a prosecutor tells the defense, look, this is going on, and I'm just so uncomfortable with it that I'm letting you know this, but please don't give me up, because it'll just be a huge problem. But of course, ultimately, they have no choice. But yeah, we do deal with the microphone issue. We do deal with it. It is a portion of the book.
Yeah, another question from Bridget, which is other than the fictionalized portion of the actual trials, do you feel that you were able to capture the feel of being in Guantanamo effectively and give the readers a feel as if they're there? And give the readers a feel as if they're there.
That's a good question. And I think the honest answer is maybe. Being physically in Guantanamo, people often ask, what's it like? And I describe it as Spencer, Indiana with good weather. It's really kind of a small, decrepit little town with one major grocery store and a few restaurants and stuff like, and then a large prison complex. I know some of that is there, whether it fully captures just the sheer what it's like to be there. I don't know. It's so much from a lawyer's perspective, and from the lawyer's perspective, the places we hung out, if you will, were the visiting rooms with the client, the courtroom, and we had an office that was assigned to us. And then one of the main two restaurants we would be at, where a lot of things happen, both in the book and in real life, are Kelly's Pub, which is a faux Irish pub in Guantanamo, serving indifferent food, and then the Navy Galley, which is sort of the best, one of the dining areas that's available to people there. Those I know are captured, but whether it captures the sort of toxic experience, I'd like to think so, but but it maybe not as well as the details of the places we met. That's a really, really good question.
So, is there really a Jack Nicholson type character at Guantanamo? Is there really a Jack Nicholson type character at Guantanamo?
Well, I'm laughing. Military. I worked a lot with military, and military people have sort of differing and sometimes predictable personalities. Most are hardworking, committed. I would say almost all are hardworking, committed individuals who believe in their mission. But occasionally you get people who are a little more tightly wound. And if that's the kind of person who's the Jack Nicholson, certainly in the book, the Chief Defense Counsel, at one point very early tells the lawyer, look, my job is to make sure trials happen. And if your client gets death, well, I don't really care. Because if he's a terrorist, I don't see why you would care. But my mission is to have a trial in 18 months, and I didn't get to be a general by failing, and I'm not going to fail. And the chief prosecutor, who is also a general, is described by one of the people who knows him as being so far up his own ass that he just can't believe it, and that he will cheat to win because he's incredibly ambitious. And you had those personality types certainly in Guantanamo and certainly in the military, without any question.
Could you once again show the title of the book? Could you once again show the title of the book?
Sure. It's Tortured Justice, Guantanamo Bay.
Tortured Justice. Now, I have two other questions. First of all, is I understand that you have either completed, or are in the process of writing a second book and a third book.
Yes. The second book, which will be entitled Tortured Justice, South Carolina, is definitely a sequel to the Guantanamo book. The Guantanamo book ends with the protagonist having left Guantanamo after the case is over, and going through a period of what he calls navel gazing, ends up helping in one of the detention centers on the on the southwest border, where individuals coming or going to the United States are detained. And in the context, he helps a young woman who has been deported. He helps her get to a place in Mexico, Celaya, where there is a safe house, and then jump forward a couple of years. She comes back to the United States illegally, ends up in South Carolina. As you know, you write what you know, and kills a police officer who is trying to rape her. And then reaches out to this lawyer whose card she still had. And so the things go from there. But it really involves, it tries to capture a lot of the issues involving undocumented people, involving police misconduct, police sexual abuse, and set in the context, of course, of a trial. The third book, which I'm very much a work in progress, will mirror, I mean, it was really a situation of art imitating life, or life imitating art, because of much of it, the original plot started before it happens, but the premise is an Indiana doctor does an abortion on a young girl from Ohio who is like 12 years old and ends up pregnant, and the doctor is then prosecuted in Ohio for conspiracy to commit illegal abortion. And it really, in some respects, mirrors to a limited degree what happened to the doctor in Indianapolis who did perform an abortion on a young woman, and who's had no criminal problems, but countless other legal problems as a result of that. So I've been working on that as well.
Okay. I have one more question. Writing something out. One more question. And this one is one I hear directed to and about lawyers, separate from your book, separate from anything we've talked about so far. And that is people, sometimes incredulously, sometimes just not understanding the justice system, express concerns about how could a lawyer defend somebody who's being charged with a particularly heinous crime and charged with the death penalty. And I'd like to give you a minute or two to explain how defense lawyers look at their role in the criminal justice system. Is that okay for a question for you today?
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's take Nashiri for an example. I was asked by the ACLU to represent him. Sort of, I remembered the cold case when it happened, but by 2007, of course, that was 7 years afterwards, and it was at best a vague memory. And I didn't know what he would be like or what I was getting into. But I felt very strongly and feel very strongly about three things. The first is that very often people end up in situations that they can't really manage. Most of the capital cases I have defended are not people who are inherently evil or depraved. They are, in many cases, people who are incredibly damaged. And as a result of that damage, don't really have the skills to manage complex situations and ultimately end up killing somebody. And I'm not trying to excuse what are often horrible things, but very often the role is to explain to the world and to a court how these things happened and to put them in a context, as Sister Ellen Perjane says in her book about the death penalty, Dead Man Walking. People are not only the worst thing they have ever done. And that is very true. And as I came to know Nashiri, I mean, two things I think were important. First, I think it's very clear to anyone who's objective that he is not the mastermind of the Cole bombing. And that the government really gave him that title to justify the fact that they had held him for 4 years and really subjected him to almost unimaginable torture. But even if he was, killing people to show that killing people is wrong, just to me never made any sense. And so, given all the problems in capital cases, given all the problems, when you read about it over and over again, I think it's very important for lawyers to be willing to stand up for the people who are, in large respects, defenseless. And so that's an obligation that I acknowledge. Many people, many lawyers have told me, no way could I do that. And I respect that. And the work can be off-putting, and just what I know about the torture, I'm sure damaged me on some level. But I think it was an important part of my responsibility, and it's something that always appealed to me. And so I consider myself very lucky to have had the opportunity to not only represent Nashiri, but also the other people I represented over the course of the years. I don't know if that I hope that answers your question.
I think it gives your answer to it, and I think it's an important answer for a lot of people. So, Rick, unless we have any other questions, I really want to thank you for this. It's been a very, very special program. Now, I know you're not in Indiana, and right now you're in Mexico. You spend time in South Carolina, but Sisters in Crime isn't only for women writers. It's not only for female writers. And if you have, it's a great little writing group. And if you're interested, you can always go online to Sisters in Crime or Speed City. I think it's speedcity.org or Speed City Sisters in Crime.org, and you can join our group.
I'd
But,
love to. If you do Zoom meetings, I'm in.
Yes, we do Zoom. We started that obviously when the pandemic hit. We started doing Zoom, and we have resumed doing in-person meetings. There you go. Right. It's speedcitysistersincrime.org. And we do all of our meetings are now hybrid. So we'll do them with some in-person, a group getting together in person, but a lot of our members who are scattered around the state, also a lot of our speakers like you who are across the country. So we have that Zoom element that I think we have determined that we're going to continue using. So anyway, it was a great program. Not seeing any more questions up there. Thanks so much for your time. Good luck with the book.
If any of you choose to get the book, I hope you enjoy it. And whatever reviews you give, good, bad, or indifferent, I'd sure appreciate.
I am certain that you're going to have some sales from this. Certainly, you're going to sell one to me. And I so much appreciate this. And I appreciate, as I did with Justice David when I talked to him, I always admired the work and the sacrifice he did on behalf, in my view, on behalf of the country in his defense work. And the same goes with you.
Well, thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Enjoy it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your time down in Mexico, and hope when you get into Indiana, give me a call or give me an email, and we'll set up. Maybe we can set up and have lunch together.
I'd like it very much, Steve.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Take care.